Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our November Eco Talk. My name is Camille Bedford, and I'm an intern with the Office of Campus Sustainability. And I'm really glad that you could all join us this evening, and I am looking forward to hearing from our guest speaker, Dr. Elena Past, as I'm sure many of you are as well. First off, I want to give you all a few rundown of sustainable things that are happening around campus, as well as a few things our office is hosting this semester before we begin. First, if you haven't already, definitely check out our Instagram account. It's at Warrior Sustainability for any and all information or updates about sustainable measures around our campus. That, in addition to our email distribution list, is how we've mostly been communicating during COVID. So that being said, if you are not on our email distribution list, please feel free to email us at sustainability@wayne.edu, and we would be happy to add you. The more the merrier. Second, for this past semester, our office's interns and Green Warriors have been posting webinars on Wednesdays, every other Wednesday through our Instagram. They're mostly fun, informational videos or infographics that give tips and tricks on how to be more sustainable in everyday life. Next Wednesday, the 25th, is our next one, and look out for a special webinar on our Wayne State's compost program, our compost pilot that's been going on for the past month or so. And it'll give you kind of a deeper look into the compost warriors, which have been the ones who have been making it all possible. So it's a very exciting, it's been a really exciting time to kind of engage online, and we would love to kind of get you guys all involved in that as well. Those are the updates that I have on our office. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email us again at sustainability@wayne.edu. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Elena Past, who will be talking to us about media and the environment. She is currently a professor of Italian at Wayne State and teaches a variety of courses in literature, film, and culture. She helps coordinate the annual Italian Film Festival in Detroit and other cinematic and cultural events in the metro area, as well as serves as a chair of the Presidential Standing Committee on Environmental Issues here at Wayne State. We are very excited to have her speaking. So without further ado, here is Dr. Elena Past.
Thank you so much, Camille. Thanks to you and Leah for organizing the Eco Talks. I'm really so honored to get to collaborate with you further. I'm so impressed with all the work that you do in the Office of Campus Sustainability. You student interns are so inspiring. So I really am looking forward to this dialogue, and hello to Daryl, whose work is also an inspiration. So I'm going to share a screen and share a PowerPoint with you, because when I talk about images, I feel like it's really important that we have them to look at together. I'm going to involve you in a couple of moments in the talk, and then we'll leave plenty of time for discussion at the end. So my talk is about media in the Anthropocene. And I'm really excited to get to share my research in the environmental humanities, and specifically in environmental media studies. So today's talk is going to have two basic streams. We're going to be thinking about how media have a real environmental impact. And then I want to take you into my wheelhouse, which is thinking about how there are many opportunities to interpret or think media ecologically. So we'll start with the sort of material impacts, and then we'll move into the more humanistic interpretation of film and media. But before we get started, I don't want to take for granted that people are familiar with the term Anthropocene, although I bet this crowd knows that term. The Anthropocene is a word that is referring to a new geological period. So it is shifting our notion of geological time spans by suggesting that in the 21st century, human impacts on the Earth's ecosystems have been the dominant drivers of ecological change. This would be a time period following the Holocene, and it represents all of the different changes and alterations that humans are making to Earth systems on a broad level. So perhaps you know that On May 21st of 2019, a group of geologists issued the results of a binding vote. They were gathered in an Anthropocene working group, and they decided that the Anthropocene should indeed be treated as a formal chronostratigraphic unit, so time and layered unit, and that the start time should be mid-20th century. One of the dates, or one of the debates in the geological community, is that if we are entering a new geological era, we need to decide when it starts. And there was some debate about whether that should be at the time of the Columbian Exchange, whether it should be defined by the Industrial Revolution. And now consensus is gathering around the idea that it should be around the 1950s, mid-20th century. So this argument suggests that changes caused by rapid population growth, our urbanization, industrialization, and globalization were so impactful that they are now accumulating in the geological earth layers with potential to be preserved far into the future. So in order, I'm just trying to get my little Zoom bars out of the way. In order for a new geological period to be designated, then geologists extract earth cores and ice cores, and they read them, looking for evidence of these changes. And what they have suggested now is that around the mid-century mark, they found radionuclides from early 1950s bomb tests. And then another thing that they've found are the existence of new minerals and rocks, assemblages of concrete, plastics, and other manufactured materials that they think will persist far into the future. So these substances are being called plastiglomerates and technofossils. They're hybrid objects that are appearing now in the Earth's layers. And they are part of the evidence that geologists are offering that says that, yes, we should be calling this a new geological era. But I think for a media scholar or a cultural scholar, they're evidence that if we are entering a new geological era, it's also a profoundly cultural one. These are consumer goods that are accumulating in the fossil layers. They were designed for obsolescence. They were destined for landfills in the post-war period. And now they're becoming fossil layers that future scientists will look at when they think about our geological epoch. So plastiglomerates and technofossils are giving us evidence that there is no longer any distinction between nature and culture, right? Between geology and anthropology. A scholar who I really love, Serena Iovino, argues that the Anthropocene shows us not just that a living species has become a geological force. She reminds us that life and geology are always deeply entangled. But for the first time in the 20th century, techno-industrial processes, military competitions, economic fluxes, use and consumption habits have become part of the geological record. So they're now talking about human beings as being a geomorphic, a world-shaping species. So in my field of research, the environmental humanities, we take up an Anthropocene invitation to read across geological, biological, and cultural archives, to see conversations across them, to pay attention to media that is about the environment, but also to see media as environment. Environmental media scholars think about the fact that film and media's industrial foundations and the environmental impacts of film and media are often detached from theorizations and analysis of media narratives. And environmental humanists are trying to sort of put the pieces back together and see the way that anytime you talk about film, you can also be mindful of the fact that film is a material object that impacts the environment in real ways. So I'm going to be talking about a variety of sort of landmark parts of the realization of the impact of environmental media. Richard Maxwell and Toby Miller were really important in pointing out that a lot of previous scholarship has argued that all of these mediatic forms, the printing press, but the photograph, film, television, and the internet change the world. They change the way we see the world. They change our world culture without changing the earth. So they sort of see them as this socio-cultural object that has no environmental impact. So my work and the work of a lot of the scholars I'll be talking about today is trying to restore this understanding of a more holistic and environmental media. So how do media impact the environment? Well, it turns out they do so in lots of ways. We can think about the sort of pre-life of the media in mining and extraction. Film and media require lots of primary materials that are rare earth metals, silver, gold, coltan, tin, and other resources extracted from the earth for digital and analog cameras, for screens and films. A number of these are extracted from conflict zones. We can move along to see waste that's generated on film sets or television production sets. Tons of plastic water bottles, paper for scripts, fuel for vehicles and generators, lights, cameras, batteries, all kinds of waste streams when you build a set and then discard it. A lot of those are made out of plastic. You have the energy costs of editing and distributing film around the globe. So back in the day, it was an actual transportation of film reels, which are heavy, and they would be sent all over the world. Today, it's digital transmission of DCP and other files, but that has its environmental costs, as we will see as well. Once you make a film and you decide that it needs to become a part of the cultural archive, we have to think about the environmental cost of storing it. Those could be in archives like the one you see in the end of sort of Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? Giant spaces that need to be cooled appropriately so that film and other media last for a long time. Also, you have enormous server farms now that are taking care of digital cloud storage and that use a really enormous amount of energy in order to run the cloud servers. And then, of course, you have the discarding of obsolete technologies and media devices. I don't know what your average life or the average life of your cell phone is, but lots of products we know are now designed for obsolescence, and then they get sent around the globe for disassembly, maybe for recycling if we're lucky. And those practices are not always sustainable either. So these are just some of the ways media impacts the environment. One of the first and important studies of the film industry was this 2006 study commissioned by UCLA of Hollywood, of the Hollywood film industry. It was looking at film and TV. Corbett and Turco did a big analysis of the Los Angeles metropolitan area to see what kinds of environmental impacts Hollywood was having on the surrounding area. And they found that the greenhouse gas emissions of Hollywood were similar to those of the aerospace and semiconductor industries. The film industry was the largest contributor to conventional air pollution in the metro LA area. And they found that one of the major problems, when studios consider being more environmentally sustainable, is that the industry is really decentralized. So they're always moving around. Production studios might have a head, but then film crews are composed of ever-changing groups of people. They focus really on short-term production teams rather than long-term physical supply chains. And so whereas a sort of brick and mortar stable industry might be able to put practices in place for sustainability, it's a lot more complicated and thus less frequent in the film industry. They also had an interesting theory that Hollywood is very image focused. They're worried about their own image. They believe that because people don't think of films as having a big environmental impact, essentially there's sort of a tacit agreement not to point out their environmental impact so that people won't start thinking about how unsustainable filmmaking can be. So that's kind of a vicious circle of unsustainable practices. One really important work that started to dig into the environmental impact of the media is this 2012 Greening the Media. I don't know if any of you are taking notes, but I can just reassure you that I have a document that I'll share at the end that has links and a bibliography for you, so you don't have to worry about that at this point. Richard Maxwell and Toby Miller have been really important path-breaking in outlining how media technology contributes to climate change, pollution growth, biodiversity decline, and habitat decimation. So this book, which is available from the Wayne State Library in a digital copy, follows media technologies from extraction to production to screening through to obsolescence. They look at things like Kodak Park's release of dioxins into the waterways around Rochester, New York. They look at what kinds of things are extracted for different kinds of screens. They sort of really dig into media industry and make some interesting observations. Another thing that I have found really fascinating and important to think about now in the COVID era, but will remain an important consideration after COVID, is the challenge of digital and streaming media, right? We think of cloud-based media as being this sort of weightless and invisible. It's almost as if it doesn't have any infrastructure. The scholar Laura Marks is working with an IT scholar, Stephen McConan, and they're trying to do some of the calculations to see what the real impacts of streaming media are. So I love this anecdote. They wrote in an article about how 34 million Americans locked down streamed Tiger King in March of 2020. And they calculated that those streams were equal to the annual electrical consumption of Rwanda in 2016. Our national Tiger King binge was equivalent to the emissions of all of those passenger cars because we rely on fossil fuels for electricity. So they are trying to really draw attention to the fact that information and communications technology contributes an enormous amount to our greenhouse gas emissions. I think they're now concluding that it's probably somewhere between 1 to 3% of GHGs, but somewhere right on par with what the airline industry generates. So, you know, when we think that, I know the impacts of Zoom. So I think about this as I teach. And, you know, having your videos on or off, the resolution that you have when you're streaming video, all of these things can impact the amount of energy that's required to run these sessions. So I included in the resources that I'll give you, there's a link to a blog by Laura Marks where she has some recommendations for sustainable or more sustainable online teaching. Her blog is funny because it's really minimalist. She's avoiding big image files, which in fact, like high resolution things cost more in terms of energy use when you're streaming them. And she makes suggestions for how you can think about being a little bit more mindful when you're on Zoom. But I think about that a lot. I'm not sure I've addressed it in any important way, but it's in my head. So what do we do, right? She gives some suggestions for what we do about Zoom teaching. What do we do in the film industry? How do we think about media? So I have this anecdotal research practice I like to do, which is when I'm starting to look for something, I'll go and do an image search and just see what Google or another search engine returns. And I actually use, I don't know if any of you do, the engine Ecosia, which I think is a German search engine that actually contributes to environmental causes. And when I did the image search for green filmmaking, it gave me green screens, Green Lantern, The Grinch, Green Book, but essentially, at least in a Google image search, there was virtually nothing about sustainable media practices. But I can tell you that some progress is being made in terms of how Hollywood and other film industries think about production. There exists, since 2009, a code of best practices in sustainable filmmaking. This was made by the Center for Media and Social Impact. And it is a checklist that would be something like a certification guide, that suggest ways that productions can minimize the resources used and the carbon created when creating a film. So they organize in terms of calculation, consumption, travel, and compensation, or carbon offsets. They say that the best practice is to do everything, but they encourage people that if you can't do very much, try to do more in your next production. And they also affirm that currently there's no certification scheme for sustainable production. So, there's a no animals are harmed message that you see at the end of certain films. That is certified by the American Humane Association, but there is thus far no official certification scheme for sustainable film production. In Italy, which is, again, my wheelhouse, this is where I do research, there are actually two new green film protocols, one called Eco Movie by Tempesta Film, and a green film certification from a regional film commission in northeastern Italy. And they both have checklists and recommendations and are being adopted in some various film productions across the European Union. So all of these are promising and helpful starting points. They're all voluntary, opt-in, usually self-policed. And anecdotally, again, I know someone who has interviewed the environmental manager for Eco Movie. She's a young woman who's been really frustrated on film productions because she'll get hired and then not given the latitude she needs to make real substantive changes on film sets. So there's always the risk of greenwashing. And until there's a real way to certify, I think, and police the process, it's hard to know whether or not this is making a real significant difference. There's also some movement in the scholarly community. So you'll see from the list of resources that I share that there's a lot of enthusiasm for publishing about media and environment. There are also two brand new journals that came out in 2019 that are dedicated to environmental media studies. One of them is open source, so everything's free and open access. They're both really exciting. And then there's some fun projects like this one, the Small File Media Film Festival. This is organized by that same woman, Laura Marks, which works in defense of the tiny image. So this is another media scholar, Jussi Parikka, who says size matters and small is better, tiny is best. This is not merely to argue for different aesthetics, but also an understanding that all media is media ecology. So by proposing making films with small file sizes, they're proposing that lower resolution streaming and lower resolution production is less energy intensive. Essentially, they were proposing a way that we can reboot our thinking about film. We can start to imagine that instead of always going like our consumer culture pushes us to for bigger, better, higher resolution, bigger screen, etc., we can start to value the small, the grainy, right? We can change what we're looking for and thus find new opportunities. And this is essentially then my project of eco-film analysis. And that's what I'm going to take you into for the second part and briefer part of my talk. And I'm going to get you involved very shortly in thinking with me. So the idea in eco-media approaches to cinema is that we can think about film from all of these angles that we've been talking about. You could think about that pre-life of film as a resource. You could analyze resource use during a film production. You could look at the sort of carbon costs of distributing a film or editing it. You could follow a film's post-life, where it's stored in an archive. You could think about e-waste and other ways that it gets discarded or reused. And then you can also, of course, analyze cinematic narratives, looking for stories about relationships of actors of all kinds. You can bring the background into the foreground. You can start to think about landscape, non-human actors. So there's a lot of interesting ways you can approach this. So as you're doing this kind of work, you have a lot of choices as you choose your canon of analysis, right? You can take a film that has an obvious ecological message, like Dark Waters. So a film like Dark Waters, which is about PFAS contamination, corporate crime, this gives us a lot of clear pathways towards an eco-media analysis, right? From a production studies standpoint, you could consider, did the production follow best practices for environmental filmmaking? Did the film go for any of those green film certifications? In terms of looking at its narrative, you could ask, okay, how does it frame the characters, the landscapes, the conflicts? Is it science accurate? Does it present that science in a way that is convincing and helpful and nuanced? You might also want to look at reception studies or star studies. How did audience react to the film? How many people saw it? How do you translate interest into a film into real interest in changing the world? Does popular media help amplify ecological messages? How does that translate into the public spheres? And how does somebody like Mark Ruffalo start to move out of Hollywood and into the political realm to try to impact the way people think about PFAS? So dark waters is kind of an easy one, but I think that it can be even more interesting to engage an ecomedia approach in the case of a film that's not so obviously about an environmental topic. I'm really interested in how we can engage in ecological thought that helps us reflect more carefully on how we divide nature from culture. And I think that if we start to envision an environment that's not just out there, it's not just wilderness or nature, it's not other than me, but it is me. It's my environment wherever I am. It's never pristine. Then suddenly we can start to see an ecological thought intertwined with social, political, economic, aesthetic questions. We can find it in cities and suburbs. We can find it in cinematic soundscapes, in cinematic formats. We can find it everywhere. So this is your first thought experiment challenge, right? Ford versus Ferrari, not an obviously ecological film, not about PFAS, but how could we read this film in ecological terms? What are some questions that we could ask of the film that could help us analyze it environmentally? So you're welcome to unmute and join the conversation now, or you can post in the chat if you have some theories. And I would just note, you don't have to have seen the film necessarily to have any theories about this. You can pretty much guess just from this image if you want to.
This is a super interesting way to view media. I guess I'd never even thought about seeing it in this way. I did see this movie and I absolutely loved it. And I think maybe one way that they were sustainable, I guess, is they used a lot of open landscapes in the movie. So it was a lot of filming in residential areas. It was a lot of filming on tracks. There was a lot of waste, I guess, in the creation of a lot of cars that they were actually driving around in the film to recreate a time when these cars look different and they couldn't, they can't use current cars for it. But it was very interesting. And it's interesting to now force yourself to think of movies and film in this way. Very cool.
Oh, good. I'm glad that it's already working. Yes, you can. So one of my points is that you can go back and read your entire cinematic canon and rethink things and be like, wait a minute, that's also about our relationship to the environment. So Michelle Sarin has asked, fuel efficiency. Yes, absolutely. If you are a car geek, you could calculate what's the fuel cost of an engine like the ones that are in these Formula One cars. Did they use real cars? Did they blow up real cars or wreck real cars? Did they use CGI, computer generated imagery? And what was the sort of carbon cost of the computer systems that had to build those images? Camille's points about landscapes and filming on location. Maybe they didn't build sets, maybe they did film on location and that was in some ways less wasteful than building fancy sets. Leah has some ideas, I think.
Yeah, you can see me toggling my mute, but I wonder if they actually did use a real vintage, I think is it a Shelby Cobra that is, that's Matt Damon's character in the film. That would be extremely interesting, but I don't know how they recovered all those vintage makes and models.
Yes, great. So yeah, if again, I always rely on my Detroit students who can recognize things about cars that I've never internalized. But yes, what kind of car was it? Was it the real vintage model? What kind of fuel, efficiency do you get there? What if you rev the engine, right? How is this representing a culture of automobility and a love affair with a car? And what kind of love affair is that love affair? Michelle is pointing out locations are important. Yes. Where's the film set? Do you remember where we're supposed to be and where we go?
I know some of it was filmed in Dearborn. Well, I don't know if it was actually filmed, but some of the set was in Dearborn.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, for Ford, some type of Ford headquarters. I can't remember.
Cool. Yes, so you guys are awesome. You have totally got the hang of this. These are my ideas and narratives, right? You could think about the cultures of automobility. You could look comparatively across Europe and the US because one of the races in Europe. You could think about locations of filming, as Michelle is suggesting, travel for cast and crew. So it turns out they filmed this in California, Georgia, maybe Michigan too, but they did not film on location in Europe. So in some ways they were saving that carbon cost. You could think about whether or not Matt Damon and Christian Bale are some of the celebrities who, at the Oscars and other places start to make comments about the importance of climate change or environmental issues. Hollywood celebs are sort of getting on board. And so that can be an interesting part of the backstory or the paratext, the information that surrounds a film.
So I had a quick question.
Oh, sure. No, please.
Kind of in terms of what we were talking about, like the lo-fi kind of films and stuff like that. So I never really thought of it like that. In terms of like, you kind of got like the cost analysis of you can either blow up a car in lo-fi, or you could do CGI. I didn't realize that there was such a, even the CGI and like the higher resolutions has such a different, lost my train of thought here. Sorry, my cat is biting me. It has such like a environmental impact, I guess, which is wild to me. And then going back to what Camille was saying about filming on location and what Leo was saying as well, I know The Mandalorian has really started to take advantage of using a lot of, they have an amazing green screen that they can just totally be anywhere. They film it within a giant room, and they don't, it looks real. It looks like they're in, Nevada or like the sand dunes somewhere. And so but then again, you get the CGI environmental impact that I totally didn't even think about. So thank you for bringing that to my attention for sure.
Yeah, so yes, The Mandalorian. I mean, all of these are opportunities for rethinking things. I think that the carbon costs of filming in a green screen room are going to be far less than, traveling around the world with a giant group of actors to try to film on location in places for the moment. But you have to think about how many technologies do they require that are suddenly obsolete? Film cameras, the analog film cameras that shot 35 millimeter reels lasted for decades. Now the film industry is relying on these cameras that constantly have higher resolution. So it is using and discarding them more quickly. The computers for CGI, the programs, the server farms, saving all of that digital data has a cost. So, to really sort of be able to weigh cost benefit, then you have to do some complicated calculations. But my first step is to think about, okay, we can't assume that just because it's digital or just because it's computer generated doesn't mean that it doesn't have a carbon footprint. Yes, obsolete and disposable technology, ugh, says Michelle. Yes. And she's pointing out really interesting things about the culture of automobiles. Okay. Yes, please.
Sorry, I think it's also interesting the result of, after the production of films, there's then like the Oscars, which is a result of like filmed where, and media festivals and stuff where they fly out all these actors and these film crews and everything, and the filming of them that go nationwide and sometimes worldwide. It's also a massive environmental impact even after the production of the film is finished.
Absolutely. The culture of celebrity has an enormous carbon footprint. So Michelle is pointing out how Leonardo DiCaprio has become really a leader in the environmental movement. There's just a fascinating anecdote about his film, I believe The Revenant. They wanted to film the last scene of it in I think a raging frozen stream, something like that. And the climate change, I think they were filming somewhere in the northern US or in Canada. The temperatures were so high at the time of year when they were trying to film it, they were higher than they should have been. And they ended up having to go to South America to finish filming. So in that case, ironically, climate change was pushing more carbon into the atmosphere in order to be able to capture a landscape in which they're making a point about human relationship with the environment. I mean, the ironies are kind of mind-blowing, but it's really interesting to think about, yes, all of the details and all the lifespan of a film, including celebrity culture, as you're pointing out, Camille. I love that you're so engaged, everyone. So I want to encourage you to continue doing this in the last section of the talk, which we're entering into now. I'm just going to remind you that we were thinking about environmental impacts of media, how we can interpret things ecologically. I wanted to say that in my book that came out last year, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to talk across those things. So I studied film production, I studied locations, and I studied people working with non-human actors, especially goats. And looked at then how you can carry your understanding of location studies and impacts into interpretation of films. And then I wanted to propose that you could help me think about a project that I did recently. I hope that many of you have seen Godfather, part 1 and part 2, to talk to you about how then my project now as a film scholar is to think all media ecologically all the time. So I was invited to contribute an essay to a book on teaching Italian cinema. And I said, I want to write something about environmental film studies. And I decided to contribute an essay about The Godfather as an ecological film. I called it the Eco Godfather. And this is what I call the stealth environmental humanities. So this is where those of us who care a lot about environmental issues are trying to urge forward thinking and conversations all the time, even when people are thinking this doesn't have anything to do with the environment. So it's my sort of secret project. And in the case of The Godfather, it was super fun as a project, and it started with a mistake. I was in one of those classrooms in Manugian with a giant high definition TV screen. We were watching a clip where Michael Corleone is coming from World War II. He's at Connie's wedding. He's sitting having this plate of food. And suddenly on the high definition screen, we could see the texture of the plate, and it looked like a polystyrene Dixie plate. And I became obsessed with this plate. I was like, wait, could that be styrofoam? The film was made in the 70s. I thought, was that an anachronism? Were people eating on styrofoam in the 40s? Did Coppola sort of cheap out on the film set and decide to use styrofoam? Is this actually possible? Is it somehow telling us something about the relationship between World War II and the sort of throwaway culture that is the mafia, right? Which throws away everything, even human lives. Is there something there in that plate? So I started digging into the history of polystyrene. I learned that it was developed by the Dow Chemical Company, which was using styrofoam for lots of wartime applications, for packaging around machine guns, for all kinds of things like that. And like a lot of products of World War II, then it needed to be repurposed into consumer culture after the war. So I read a really interesting history of plastics that talked about how after World War II, plastic started to infiltrate every pore of our daily life, entering our clothes, our homes, our cars, our playthings, our workplaces, our bodies, right? We are full of microplastics, as we know. And I thought, oh my God, this is amazing. Well, ultimately, rewatching, looking for information, I concluded that this is probably not a styrofoam plate. And he couldn't have been eating on a styrofoam plate in 1945. It wasn't until the mid-1950s that styrofoam consumer goods, sort of cups and plates, were widely available. But the idea that this was a possibility started me thinking, how else is The Godfather an environmental film? So I developed a theory that the story of The Godfather is the story of the Corleone's family's move from the Sicilian countryside into the New York suburbs, into the American West, and that this is reproducing, it's showing us the vectors of environmental problems. We see resource overuse, disregard for the health of the land, planned obsolescence, and rampant waste of people and things. So you start out with what I was calling the agro-mafia. It becomes a suburban mafia, and then it moves to LA and becomes the money mafia. And we're seeing essentially the same environmental degradation, the same overblown collapsing consumer culture of the Anthropocene. So the agro-mafia, we start out with oranges and olive oil in the Sicilian countryside. The Godfather Part 1 and Part 2 go from 1901 until 1961. And if we dig into the history of the Corleone family and the mafia itself, we discover that the Sicilian citrus trade has an enormous role in the development of the mafia. Citrus was a prized commodity that was especially popular in the UK and the US. It was also really easy to interrupt. It was really easy to vandalize. It required irrigation, and it was easy for people to cut off water supplies to citrus groves and thus require farmers to respond to requests for extortion money. It also, because of the transportation and moving it to the docks and warehouses and then transporting it overseas, there was room for lots of money to be paid along the way, along the routes. And so this sort of pastoral Italian countryside, which is part of the beginnings of Godfather 1 and 2, is actually in some ways nourishing the same criminal life that we will see in the mafia. And we see once the Corleone family gets to New York, there are lots of vegetable markets. They're making their money initially as these sort of traders in olive oil and produce. So then we follow them through to the Garden State when they become members of suburbia, the landscape of mass consumption, which was built largely on what had formerly been agricultural fields. So we see that their sort of agro-mafia is being substituted with the suburban lifestyle and consumer culture. There's more room for parked cars, there's bigger house compounds, there's bigger houses. And we also have really interesting, if you're digging into the production, oddities. These two scenes, the bottom one and the top one, are immediately edited together. So Michael and Kay are shopping for Christmas gifts, and then Luca Brasi, one of the strongmen for the Corleone family, is about to go carry out a hit. And we have the sound bridge of Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas that ties the Michael and Kay scene to the Luca Brasi scene. Mike and Kay Kay is telling Mike what she bought for his family, which includes an object called the Reynolds pen, which was this disposable ink pen that became a fetishized consumer object right after World War II. In fact, when it went out for sale for the first time in New York, there was a mob. They had to call in the police because so many people rushed in to buy it. It cost something like, in today's dollars, $175 per pen. But it was a fetishized object, again, that people were just rabid to get their hands on. And so then Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas ties over, and we hear that playing in the background when Luca Brasi is putting on his Kevlar vest. So Kevlar is another one of the bulletproof vests are made from plastic derivative, and they're another product that's sort of post-World War II that ties together the consumer culture. Again, it's sort of the way that World War II culture also facilitated a consumer culture of abundance. And in the mafia, they're absolutely connected. So those kinds of histories make it particularly interesting that when we see the end of Don Vito Corleone, when he dies, he's in a tomato garden. Here we have a couple of production details that are interesting. The wall around the walled compound was built from polystyrene. So I know that to be a detail that was sort of plasticized in the production. But then he and his grandson are playing with this little spray gun. I spent a lot of time asking people what they thought it might be if they had families who had, suburban gardens and ever used a spray like that. They're spraying the leaves with something. And shortly after the scene, Don Vito collapses, and it's the end of his reign in the mafia. I found one reference written by an Italian-American scholar who says, in that era, this is almost inevitably DDT in that spray can. So another production detail that's interesting is that the tomato plants that are planted in the garden were out of season, and so they had to be shipped to the set at great cost. And the tomatoes themselves had to be shipped in from California because they weren't growing in New Jersey at the time. So we have the carbon cost of the set, we have the toxic suburban garden, the toxic family garden, and we have the end of the suburban mafia in the scene. It's sort of a reminder of how there's this continuity between the waste of the mafia, again, the bullets that they spray everywhere that contaminate the ground, and the sort of apparently innocent consumer culture that is part of that demise. Okay, so then finally, their westward expansion, the Corleones head out west and set up shop, making most of their money from casinos. And here they're basically entirely divorced from the land now. There's no garden at their Lake Tahoe estate, right? There's just this big lawn. And when they have a party on the lawn, oops, I didn't get that photo, we can see that they have guests who are being entertained. There's Coke bottles and cigarettes on the tables. So they've sort of given in to the fact that consumer culture is unhealthy. A production detail that's fascinating here is that the Corleone family estate was the house of one of the backers of the Hoover Dam. If you know anything about the Hoover Dam, it's this massive earthworks problem, which essentially makes it possible to have enormous populations in Los Angeles, Phoenix, Denver, Salt Lake City, San Diego, which are areas that are now sort of pushing the limits of how many people can live in a place where the climate is arid and they are running out of water at times. So the Corleone families move out to the west and to the land of Las Vegas and casinos seems to me to be the conclusion of a journey that is ripping out the roots of the agro-mafia and transporting it to this unsustainable lifestyle. At the end of that film, Godfather Part 2, we see this fade between 1941, sometime early in the 20th century where Michael is a baby, and then Michael sitting here at his Lake Tahoe estate. And I think what we're seeing in the end, that Michael had this fantasy of total control of his environment, but it's also a fantasy of total control of the environment, any environment. And that is the same fantasy that has led us to the brink of real environmental catastrophe. So even a film like The Mafia, which is apparently this human drama, can be reread, I think, as a powerful environmental drama. So I love a thinker called Timothy Morton, who says, once you've started thinking the ecological thought, you can't unthink it. And this is essentially my mission as a teacher scholar, to plant those seeds that force you to realize that all art is environmental, that every sort of aspect of your life, including the ones that feel virtual, digital, and distant, have environmental impacts. And that this awareness is sort of a first step to imagining alternative pathways and ways that we can make positive differences and live, hopefully, more sustainably. So I'm going to now share, I see Grace has to take off. I will share the Google Doc and I will X out of my PowerPoint presentation, and then would love to hear more from you. Theories about the Godfather, questions, comments about anything.
That was excellent. Oh my gosh.
Good.
I'm definitely going to be, thank you for providing that lens of being able to look at things more critically through the environmental lens. I think what is the most exciting part about this and understanding this is that there are ways that we can develop, no matter what it may be, media, everyday life, we can develop more sustainable ways for it. And I think that that's exciting because it leaves a lot of room for innovation and coming together to collaborate, just more exciting solutions rather than just being stuck in this same old environment of just consumption and individualism and like the mafia, just killing, I guess, to say the least.
Self-defeating, yes. Yeah, that is the goal. And the goal is, I think, at least the first goal is to start conversations and to feel like you can start conversations with people who are not going to go with you to see an inconvenient truth, right? But
Right.
who would want to see Tiger King with you. And then, and I haven't seen Tiger King. I'm kind of horrified by the idea of it. But I know that if I watched it, I would want to talk about all kinds of things that come up in a post-humanist or animal studies lens. And I know that those opportunities are there.
Absolutely. And that's how you connect with people and make change is you have to understand, what they like and what their concerns are and provide and let them know that there are other sustainable solutions for it.
Right, kind of the big tent version of environmentalism.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely want to say my mind is like absolutely blown at the proportions of all of this waste that is behind a seemingly, innocent industry. And, you can just kind of see the final product, and the behind the scenes aspect is depicted as like an extra like exciting, event if you were to watch something behind the scenes online. And it makes me think, you brought up the point of the tomatoes that were out of season that they had to fly in. And a lot of the emphasis of directors I know is making sure, like, being able to get things right on screen. And I know my dad is a big history buff, and so he watches all the World War II movies, and if he sees one thing wrong, in the depiction of like a plane or of like some kind of craft kind of thing, if something's not right, he knows exactly what it is and he's able to point it out. And so a lot of waste comes with that and trying to get things like right on screen. And it's just very interesting to see and to learn about all these different things that impact that. It's crazy.
Let's see. Yeah, seemingly unlikely connections in tackling problems. Yes, it is fun to see environmental issues arise in unlikely places. I mean, I think that it's a really fascinating project, and it's not to, condemn media, because I think it is such a powerful tool for resituating ourselves, reimagining our position in the universe. Media can be so powerful as a tool for shaping the imagination or for providing information. But I couldn't help but watch. I was really excited to see Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything, the documentary. A really powerful work about climate change, about the need for urgent action. And the documentary never problematized the carbon footprint of making the documentary. And they fly all over the world. And that to me it's maybe unforgivable, right? I mean, if you're going to make a film about climate change, then you need to sort of be on the front line saying, okay, and in making this film, I recognize my impact, but I'm doing it, I'm calculating it this way, or I'm balancing things, thinking the impact is going to outweigh the costs. But yeah, Michelle is saying hypocritical, maybe. And as scholars, as environmental media scholars, environmental scholars, we're all hypocrites because we travel, we go to conferences to talk about these things. And that's hard to reconcile too. You need to talk to people to develop new ideas, but you don't want to be, worsening a problem, or just sort of relying on the fact it's not going to affect your generation of scholars and thinkers.
Hey, Elena.
Hi, Daryl.
Hi. I really enjoyed the everything, and the thing that kind of caught me was, as you were telling the story and the migrations, and really that kind of mirrors, mirrors our society. And so, as you're talking, and I'm thinking, okay, well, this is what happened during this time, and the migration out west, and just how all of the impacts that we've had as a result of our migration and immigration and everything. It's just really got me to thinking. It's a very thoughtful. You gave a very thoughtful presentation that really stimulated the my thinking. So I wanted to thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you. And yes, that migration westward, the whole manifest destiny. In the article, I talk a little bit about the train travel that becomes air travel, and car travel. But yeah, I think the impacts of our moving out west, again, not to say that we shouldn't or that we can't be migrants, we are migrants, but to think about what that implies environmentally and where people are going now, I think is really important.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for all this information and for the resources in the Google Doc. I'm definitely really excited to check out that movie that you had mentioned. I wrote it down somewhere. The Greening the Media. I think that's definitely something that I would really love to watch and listen in on and learn from. So thank you for all the sources, and thank you for joining us and being our speaker for November's Eco Talk. I definitely enjoyed it, and I think a lot of other people really got a lot out of it. So we appreciate you joining, and we appreciate everybody who was able to join us for this Eco Talk. Please look out for future ones. We have one every month towards the end of the month. We try to keep it on the last Friday at 5 p.m. of every month. And like I said, definitely reach out to us at our email, sustainability@wayne.edu, and follow us on Instagram, Warrior Sustainability. And we will see you all next time. Thank you all so much for joining us. And again, thank you, Dr. Elena Past, for joining us in this discussion.
Thanks, everyone. You're amazing to be here on a Friday afternoon, and I really enjoyed talking with all of you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks for putting it on. It was great, you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elena. That was amazing.
Oh, thank you.
And visually stunning. You put together a beautiful PowerPoint. I'm going to take
if
lessons
you're talking
from
about
you.
film, you have to use, I didn't have to do it. Francis Ford Coppola did it, right? But thank you. I really appreciate it. And the lively comments in the chat are wonderful.
Yeah, I definitely feel like I learned a lot. And, I was just thinking about the waste of Disney and all of the animals that, stuffed animals and toys and stuff they're able to get out of movies and stuff. And, you don't think about it. You want it to be innocent, but it's really a culprit of a major environmental issue. So crazy. It totally blew my mind. So thank you. I really appreciate you, joining us for this.
Oh, it was fun. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate all of you. You do amazing work.
Well, I'm glad you could join us. Have a good evening.
Good night, everyone. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. Enjoy the weekend.
Thank you. You too.